I still remember that evening as if it happened yesterday. The smell of freshly cut roses, the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and my own nervous heartbeat echoing inside my chest. I was standing at the edge of a crowded hall, trying to keep a polite smile while my hands trembled slightly. It was the first time I was meeting my boyfriend's family properly. He had told me it was just a small gathering, but when I arrived, I realized it was more like a grand party, full of well-dressed guests, business associates, and distant relatives I had never even heard of. His father, Mr. Farrow, was a man whose presence filled the room long before he spoke. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes that seemed to scan everyone like a businessman evaluating stocks. He was wealthy, not just in the sense of having money, but in that quiet arrogance that wealth can sometimes bring. He didn't say much at first, but when he did, people leaned in and listened. I could feel the invisible line between his kind and people like me. I came from a modest family. My mother was a school teacher, and my father ran a small hardware store. We were comfortable but not rich. I had earned my education through scholarships and part-time jobs. When I met Daniel, my boyfriend, in university, we connected not because of money or status, but because of the way we thought. He was kind, curious, and funny in a quiet way. He never treated me like I was beneath him, even though he came from a much more privileged background. At least that's what I believed. That night I wore a simple pastel dress. Nothing extravagant, just something that made me feel confident. Daniel had texted me earlier, "You'll be perfect. Just be yourself." I had spent half an hour repeating that in my head like a mantra. Just be myself. When I arrived, Daniel introduced me around. His mother was kind, polite and warm, though a bit distant, as if she wasn't sure how close to stand to me. His father, however, was harder to read. At first he smiled, shook my hand, and said, "So you're the one Daniel can't stop talking about." His tone was neutral, his expression unreadable. I tried to see that as a good sign. But as the evening went on, I began to feel the tension in his body language. Whenever I spoke about my work, I was then working as a junior designer at a local firm. He seemed distracted, like I was talking about something irrelevant. When someone asked about my family, he quietly sipped his drink without looking at me. Small things, but enough to make me uneasy. The real moment, though, came much later. The hall had grown louder. People were laughing, some dancing. A few guests were standing near the buffet table, and I was talking to Daniel about a funny story from our university days. That's when his father walked over, a glass of wine in his hand, looking unusually animated. He had been drinking more than usual, I later realized. His voice was loud enough for nearby guests to turn their heads when he spoke. "Daniel," he said with a slightly slurred chuckle, "I was just telling Mr. Collins how you've always had good taste, but now," he turned toward me, eyes narrowing in mock curiosity, "now I'm starting to question it." A few people laughed awkwardly, thinking maybe he was joking. I smiled politely, unsure how to react. Daniel frowned. "Dad, what are you talking about?" he asked. Mr. Farrow smirked, leaning slightly toward me. "You know, son, it's fine to explore different kinds of people. It builds character." He took another sip, his tone turning sharper. "But some things are better left outside your circle. Not everyone fits." I could feel my chest tightening. My hands went cold, but I kept my face still, calm, controlled. I had been raised to be respectful, to not cause scenes. Daniel looked visibly angry. "Dad, stop," he said firmly. "You're being rude." But his father wasn't done. He gestured toward me with the hand that held his glass. "I mean, come on. Look at her, son. You're from a family that's built generations of reputation. And she—" He paused, smirk widening. "She's what? A local designer from the lower side of town? Garbage in a garden party." The moment he said it, the word garbage seemed to echo across the room. The laughter died instantly. Even the music felt quieter. I froze, unable to breathe for a second. My heart felt like it was dropping into a pit. Everyone around us looked uncomfortable. Some avoiding eye contact, others pretending not to have heard. Daniel immediately turned red with anger. "Dad, that's enough!" he snapped. "You owe her an apology." But his father just waved a dismissive hand. "Relax, Daniel. It's just a joke. A joke." That's what he called it. A joke at my expense, in front of people I had never met, in a room full of witnesses. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but I couldn't. My throat felt dry. My eyes burned, but I refused to cry there. Crying would have given him the satisfaction of knowing he had hurt me, so I just stood up straight, forced a small smile, and said softly, "Excuse me." Then I turned around and walked out. Daniel came after me, calling my name, but I didn't stop. I needed space. I needed to breathe. Outside, the air was cool and sharp. I stood by my car for a few minutes, trying to steady my shaking hands. I didn't want to break down, not yet. When Daniel finally caught up, he was furious, not at me, but at his father. "He had no right," he said again and again. "He had no right to say that." I could see he meant it, but I also knew he was trapped between his loyalty to me and his obedience to his family. That was the first time I realized how deep those family expectations went. I told him, calmly, that I needed to go home. He tried to stop me, to explain, but I just said, "Daniel, please, not tonight." That night I sat in bed replaying the moment over and over. The way his father looked at me, not with hatred, but with superiority. The kind of look that said, "You will never be enough." I could have screamed, could have cried, could have sworn to never see Daniel again, but I didn't. I just sat there quietly and thought. It wasn't just about humiliation. It was about how people like him believed they could define someone's worth with a single word. Garbage. That word stuck in my mind like a stain. Over the next few days, I avoided Daniel. He texted, called, even came to my office once, but I kept things short. I needed time, not just to heal, but to think. I wasn't sure if I could ever face his family again. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to. But then something unexpected happened. My boss called me in for a meeting. He said a new client had requested me personally to lead a small design project, a boutique brand that wanted a full rebranding. It wasn't huge, but it was significant enough to get my name out there. I took it as a sign. Maybe life was giving me something to focus on. So I poured myself into work. I stopped thinking about revenge, about anger, about proving myself. I just worked, late nights, weekends, whatever it took. But deep down, I knew something was changing. Every success, every small win, every compliment from a client, all of it was quietly rebuilding the part of me that Mr. Farrow had tried to crush. Still, his words stayed with me. They didn't make me bitter, but they made me sharper, stronger. I started to see that the best revenge wasn't to shout back, or to embarrass him publicly, but to live in a way that made his judgment meaningless. Months passed. I grew in my career faster than I expected. My projects got noticed, and my designs started appearing in magazines. One day, Daniel called again, this time with something different in his voice. "Dad wants to see you," he said softly. He wants to talk." I almost laughed. After everything that had happened, now he wanted to talk? I didn't say yes immediately. I told Daniel I'd think about it. And I did. Long and hard. Because I had learned something important in those months. Revenge doesn't have to be loud or cruel. Sometimes it's quiet, deliberate, and earned through patience. That meeting, when I finally saw Mr. Farrow again, would change everything. But that came later. For now, I remember that night not as the night I was humiliated, but as the night I began rewriting my story. The night when being called garbage lit a fire that would quietly reshape everything that came after. After that night, my life quietly divided itself into two parts, before and after. Before, I was someone who still cared too much about how others saw me. Someone who tried to fit into circles that were never meant to make me comfortable. After that night, I stopped trying to prove myself to anyone. I simply began to build. The morning after the party, I woke up with puffy eyes and an aching heart. I didn't cry much, but what hurt most was the memory of standing there, frozen, while people looked away. That kind of silence, when everyone pretends not to notice your humiliation, stays with you longer than the insult itself. I sat at my small kitchen table, coffee going cold, and decided that I wouldn't let that moment define me. I wanted to move forward, but this time, differently. My work became my focus. The project I had been assigned was for a boutique fashion brand that wanted a fresh, modern identity. They didn't have a big budget, but they gave me creative freedom. I worked day and night on it, studying every small detail: colors, fonts, textures, layouts. For weeks, my apartment was filled with sketches, print samples, and sticky notes with ideas scribbled on them. When the final presentation came, I was nervous, but I believed in what I'd created. The clients loved it. They called my designs refreshing and grounded, and within a month, that project brought in 2 new referrals. Slowly, my reputation began to grow, not through marketing or connections, but through quiet word of mouth. At first, I didn't realize how much I had changed. I was calmer now, more focused. People at work noticed too. My boss began trusting me with bigger accounts. I was promoted to lead designer within 6 months, something that usually took years. Around that time, Daniel reached out again. He had been patient, giving me space. We met for coffee after a long silence. His eyes were soft, full of guilt. "I still can't believe he said that," he told me. He's never been kind with words, but that night was too much. "I'm sorry," I smiled faintly. "You don't need to apologize for him," I said. But deep inside, I was still cautious. Love doesn't vanish overnight, but respect once cracked doesn't heal quickly. We talked for hours, not about what happened, but about life, my work, his projects, small things. It was awkward at first, but familiar. Before we left, he said something I didn't expect. "He's seen your name in a magazine article. He asked if that's you." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really?" "Yeah," he said, nodding. He looked surprised. That word, surprised, settled in my mind like a quiet spark. Maybe that was the beginning of my calm revenge. Not planned, not forced, but unfolding naturally through the steady rhythm of my own progress. Over the next year, my life transformed. I started getting invitations to speak at small design events. My projects began featuring in online design journals. I didn't become rich or famous overnight, but I was growing steadily, authentically. My confidence was no longer fragile. I didn't measure my worth by someone else's approval. One evening, about a year and a half after that fateful party, I received a call from Daniel. "My father's company is rebranding," he said carefully. "They're looking for a design consultant. I told him about you." I almost laughed, but not out of mockery, more like disbelief. "You told your father? The same man who called me garbage?" He winced. "I know how it sounds. But he's different now. Or at least, trying to be. I think he respects what you've done." I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to say no immediately, but another part of me, the quiet, wiser part, told me this might be the moment fate had been slowly building toward. I agreed to meet them, but on my terms. No desperation, no emotional involvement, just professionalism. The meeting was scheduled at their corporate office, a tall glass building that seemed to pierce the sky. As I walked through the lobby, memories from that humiliating night flickered in my mind. His smirk, his voice, that cruel word. But I didn't let it shake me. I had changed. I wasn't that timid girl anymore. When I entered the conference room, Mr. Farrow was already there, sitting at the head of the table. He looked older, not physically, but in the kind of way that comes from realizing life doesn't always go according to your script. Daniel was beside him, looking both nervous and proud. "Ms. Parker," Mr. Farrow said, standing up to shake my hand. His tone was formal, distant, but respectful. "Thank you for coming." I smiled calmly, meeting his eyes. "Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Farrow." We spoke about the project for nearly an hour. He listened carefully, asked intelligent questions, and took notes. It was strange. He was polite, even attentive. No arrogance, no dismissive tone. Still, I didn't let that soften me. I was there to work, not to be forgiven. When the meeting ended, he said something that caught me off guard. "You've done well for yourself," he said quietly. "I've read about your work. You're very talented." I looked at him, studying his expression. There was no sarcasm, no mockery, just humility. "Thank you," I said simply. That night, I sat by my window thinking about the meeting. Part of me felt vindicated. Not because I had hurt him, but because I hadn't needed to. My success had spoken louder than anything I could have said. But life, as I was learning, had its own way of adding layers to a story. A few months later, I was officially hired as a consultant for their company's rebranding campaign. It was a 6-month project, challenging, high-profile, and well-paid. I accepted, not out of spite, but because it was an opportunity I had earned. Working with Mr. Farrow was strange at first. The same man who once dismissed me now listened to my ideas, sometimes even asking for my opinion privately before meetings. He didn't try to apologize directly, but his behavior said what words couldn't. He respected me now, maybe even admired me. One afternoon, we were reviewing some mock-ups for their new logo when he suddenly said, "You know, I used to think design was just decoration. I didn't understand how much psychology and strategy goes into it." I nodded, smiling faintly. "Most people don't," I replied. He looked at me, a little regret flickering in his eyes. "You must think I'm a terrible man," he said after a pause. I didn't answer immediately. I looked out the window, the city skyline shimmering in the late sunlight. "I think people make mistakes when they forget that respect isn't something you give based on titles or wealth," I said slowly. "It's about how you treat others, especially when no one's watching." He was silent for a long moment, then said softly, "You're right." That was the closest thing to an apology I ever received from him. And strangely, it was enough. I didn't need him to say the exact words. The change in his tone, his eyes, his actions, they all spoke for him. During those months, Daniel and I grew closer again. We were cautious, more mature this time. He told me his father had gone through some rough times. A business deal gone wrong, health issues, and perhaps a growing realization that money doesn't protect you from regret. Life had humbled him in ways no one else could. One evening, near the end of the project, the company hosted a dinner to celebrate the completion of their rebranding. It wasn't as grand as the party from that night years ago, but it was elegant. There were familiar faces, polite laughter, and a quiet dignity to it all. When it was my turn to speak briefly about the creative process, I stood confidently and thanked the team. I spoke about transformation, how every brand, just like every person, has to evolve through its challenges to discover its true identity. When I finished, there was a warm round of applause. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mr. Farrow smiling, genuinely this time. He even raised his glass slightly in my direction. Later, as I was leaving, he approached me near the exit. "I owe you something," he said. I looked at him curiously. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Farrow." He shook his head. "I owe you respect. And perhaps a thank you. You've shown me what real dignity looks like." I smiled softly. "Thank you. That means more than you think." And it did. Because in that moment, I realized my revenge was complete. And it had been calm, quiet, and graceful. I hadn't needed to shout, insult, or humiliate him back. I had simply become someone he could no longer look down on. After that project, I moved on to bigger things. My career took me to new cities, new opportunities. Daniel and I stayed in touch, though our paths eventually went different ways. There was no bitterness, just mutual respect and understanding. Sometimes when I think back to that night, the laughter, the humiliation, the word garbage, I smile faintly. Because that word no longer hurts. It reminds me of how far I've come. How a moment meant to break me ended up shaping me into someone stronger, wiser, and more peaceful. Revenge, I've learned, doesn't always need to roar. Sometimes it's as quiet as success. And maybe that's the most powerful kind of revenge there is. When the project with Mr. Farrow's company ended, I thought that chapter of my life was closed for good. I had proven what I needed to prove. The humiliation of that night no longer lived inside me. It had turned into a quiet strength that guided me every time I faced doubt. But life, I've come to learn, doesn't close doors so neatly. Some stories continue in softer ways, revisiting you not to reopen old wounds, but to show how much you've healed. A few months after the rebranding launch, I was invited to speak at a regional business conference about creative strategy and brand identity. It was my first time addressing a large audience of executives, entrepreneurs, and professionals. I spent days preparing, organizing slides, rehearsing transitions, making sure every word sounded natural. The night before the event, I sat in my apartment, sipping tea, staring at my notes. A thought crossed my mind. Years ago, I would have felt terrified standing in front of people like that. People who once represented everything I feared: judgment, class differences, silent evaluations. But now I felt calm, not because I thought I was better than them, but because I finally knew who I was. The next day, as I stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinded me. But when I began speaking, the fear melted away. I talked about authenticity, about the importance of staying true to one's story. I said something that came from a very personal place. Sometimes the world tries to define your worth before it knows your story. But the truth is, the story you live, the one you write through your patience, effort, and grace, will always be louder than any label they give you. The audience grew quiet, then broke into warm applause. It wasn't about the applause itself. It was about knowing that my words had reached someone, maybe someone who had been through a moment like mine. After my talk, people came to shake my hand, to thank me. Among them, to my complete surprise, was Mr. Farrow's wife, Daniel's mother. She looked the same, graceful and polite, though there was something softer in her eyes now. "I wanted to come personally," she said gently. "I saw your name in the program and told my husband we should listen. He's here too, just at the back. He didn't want to interrupt you." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Then I smiled genuinely. "I'm glad you came." She squeezed my hand. "You've grown into such an admirable woman. I always believed you would." Later, as the hall emptied, I saw Mr. Farrow standing near the exit, hands clasped behind his back. He looked different, simpler somehow. No expensive arrogance, no sharpness in his tone. Just a man who seemed to have finally learned humility. "You spoke beautifully," he said. "Thank you," I replied. He hesitated, then added, "I deserved to be called out that night. Not by you, but by life. It took me years to realize that money and status don't buy decency." I nodded slowly. "We all learn in different ways." He looked at me then, not with pity, not with pride, but with quiet respect. "I was wrong about you," he said, "and wrong about what matters. I hope you can forgive me." For a moment, I just looked at him. The younger version of me would have wanted to say something dramatic, maybe sharp, but I wasn't that girl anymore. I didn't need to prove my strength through words. "I forgave you long ago," I said softly. "I just needed to live enough life to know that forgiveness isn't weakness." He smiled faintly, relief flickering in his eyes. "You've become an extraordinary woman, you know that?" "Thank you," I said again, "but I'm still learning." That evening, as I drove home, I realized something profound. Revenge isn't really about the other person. It's about reclaiming the space they once occupied in your mind. The moment you no longer need them to feel small for you to feel whole, that's when you truly win. A year later, I started my own design firm. It began with 2 people and 1 borrowed desk in a co-working space. I named it Arc Studio, inspired by the idea that every story, even the painful ones, has an arc, a journey that bends toward meaning. The first big client came through an unexpected source, Mr. Farrow himself. He referred one of his partners to us, telling them, "She's the best in the business." When my assistant told me that, I sat quietly for a few moments, feeling a wave of quiet irony mixed with gratitude. The man who once called me garbage was now helping open doors for my future. Life truly had a poetic sense of balance. Arc Studio grew fast. We moved into a small office downtown, took on larger contracts, and eventually hired a dozen people. I loved mentoring young designers, especially those from small towns or modest backgrounds, people who reminded me of myself when I was starting out. One afternoon, a young intern named Lila approached me after work. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said shyly. "Of course. Have you ever been made to feel like you didn't belong? Like you weren't enough?" I smiled softly. "Yes," I said. "Once, and it changed my life." She frowned. "How did you deal with it?" I looked out the window, the city lights flickering in the dusk. "By not fighting for their approval," I said slowly. "By building something that didn't need it. Sometimes the best way to respond is to grow quietly until your existence itself becomes the answer." Lila nodded thoughtfully. "That's powerful," I smiled. "It's peaceful, and peace is stronger than anger." That night, after everyone left, I stayed late, going through some old files. Among them was a photo from years ago, Daniel and me at that infamous party. I stared at it for a long time. The young woman in the picture looked uncertain, a bit out of place. I wanted to tell her so many things, that she would rise, that she would one day thank the moment that hurt her, that the pain would turn into something beautiful. A few months later, I received an invitation to a charity gala organized by the Pharaohs. It was a fundraiser for education, specifically scholarships for students from underprivileged backgrounds. The irony was not lost on me. I wasn't sure whether to attend, but something inside me nudged me to go. Not out of curiosity, but out of closure. The event was elegant but simple this time. No flashy decorations, no loud displays of wealth. It had warmth, a sense of purpose. Mr. and Mrs. Pharaoh greeted guests personally, smiling sincerely. When they saw me, their faces lit up with genuine pleasure. "I'm so happy you came," Mrs. Pharaoh said. "You're actually one of the inspirations behind this foundation." I blinked. "Me?" she nodded. "After everything that happened, we realized how often society judges people based on appearance, background, or wealth. We wanted to do something meaningful, so we started this scholarship program." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I just smiled and said, "That's wonderful." Later in the evening, during the speeches, Mr. Pharaoh took the stage. His voice was steadier than I remembered, but humble. "Many years ago," he said, "I said something cruel to someone who didn't deserve it. That moment stayed with me. It reminded me that character isn't measured by wealth, but by kindness. Tonight, I dedicate this program to those who rise above judgment, to those who turn pain into purpose." The audience applauded. I sat there quietly, feeling tears sting my eyes, not of sadness, but of release. Sometimes the world really does come full circle. When the event ended, Mr. Pharaoh found me near the exit. "I wanted to thank you again," he said softly, "for showing me grace when I didn't deserve it." I smiled. "We all grow at our own pace. What matters is that we do," he nodded. "I hope you'll stay connected with the foundation. We'd love for you to mentor some of our scholarship students." And that's how another chapter began, one I never saw coming. I started volunteering as a mentor, meeting young people with big dreams and small chances. Every time I told them my story, sometimes only in fragments, I could see their eyes light up. Because they understood that someone's cruel word doesn't decide your future. Looking back now, I can see how everything fit together, like pieces of a puzzle that only make sense when you step far enough away. If that night hadn't happened, if I hadn't been humiliated, hurt, and forced to confront my insecurities, I might never have grown into the person I am today. Sometimes I think about revenge and how people imagine it. Loud confrontations, clever payback, triumphant moments. But the truth is, real revenge is quiet. It's the peace you feel when you no longer need to win. It's waking up one day and realizing that the people who tried to belittle you no longer have power over your thoughts. Revenge, at its calmest, is self-mastery. And maybe that's why I started my channel, My Calm Revenge. Because I know there are others out there who've been hurt in quiet ways. People who've been called names, dismissed, underestimated, made to feel small. I want them to know that they can rise, not through anger, but through purpose. So if you're listening to my story right now, remember this. The best way to answer cruelty is to become everything they said you couldn't be. Not to make them regret it, but to make yourself proud. And if you ever find yourself standing in a room where someone tries to define your worth, take a deep breath, stand tall, and remind yourself silently. Their words are noise. My actions will be the echo that lasts. Because someday, the world will hear your story, and they'll see how calm, steady, and unstoppable you became. Thank you for spending your time with me today. If my story touched you, if it reminded you that dignity is the quietest form of revenge, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to My Calm Revenge.